The topic for today is U.S. railroads in World War I, and the presenter is Mark Jelavich. Hopefully, all of this is going to be recorded, and you should be able to see the slides on the screen.
Okay. There are a couple of reasons to look at U.S. railways in the First World War. First of all, historically, it was temporary nationalization of vital U.S. industry. That hasn't really occurred since then. It's in the pre-highway era when rail carried almost all intercity cargo and passengers. And so the rail industry was pretty much the way to get around both freight and people. In the wake of the 1910s, 1920s, you had a set of merger waves that consolidated the American rail companies into 6 major enterprises that we have today. And it's an interesting study in wartime logistics and the competition that arose between military and civilian needs in 1917 and 1918. If you look at how the rail network expanded in the United States after 1865, in 1890, the U.S. rail network had about 164,000 miles of trackage with operating revenue of about $1 billion. 10 years later, the network expanded 193,000 miles with operating revenues about $1.4 billion. These are not adjusted for inflation, by the way. By the advent of the war, America's entry into the war in 1916, you had about 250,000 miles of trackage with about $1.7 billion in revenue. Fast forward to 2023, and the network has declined to 140,000 miles, with $94 billion in total revenue. And employment kind of followed the same trace. In 1890, there were about 80,000 workers employed by railways. 10 years later, there were over 1 million employed, about 1.7 million employed in 1916. But now there are only about 123,000 people employed in railways in the United States. If you look at the geographic orientation of the American railway system, it's very much east-west. And in particular, in the early 1900s, you were talking about traffic essentially flowing between the East Coast and the central part of the United States. There was very little north-south traffic to speak of. And the rail network, again, was primarily an east-west orientation. We'll talk about a little bit later. That has some implications for how the war affected rail traffic. But in particular, what the rail network linked up the central U.S. and eastern U.S. with East Coast ports. And if you look at imported tonnage estimates as a sort of a metric of port capacity in 1914, Atlantic Gulf ports handle about half of all imported tonnage in the United States. Gulf Coast ports about 14%, Pacific Coast ports about 11%. Mainly was seaborne traffic that traveled through Canada. And in 1916, American railways handled about 77% of intercity freight traffic. Most of the rest went by water, and almost all of the intercity passenger traffic. By contrast, in 2023, rail carried about 40% of intercity freight traffic. The rest of it primarily carried in the U.S. by truck. If you look at waterways in the U.S., on the other hand, it was very much a north-south system as opposed to east-west system with, if you will, the main arteries being the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. And so that restricted very much what the type of traffic that water could carry. Along with the river system, you also had the intercoastal waterways along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. If you look at the major ports in the U.S. In 1914, by far the largest port area was New York, including Newark. About 60 million tons of imported tonnage was handled that way. We use imported tonnage, by the way, because it would have gone through customs, and therefore customs had a pretty accurate measure of what was being shipped out of the U.S. Data on exports was being brought into the U.S. Data on exports from the U.S. through the ports is a little iffier. But far behind in second place was Boston, followed by Washington State. This is Seattle and Tacoma. New Orleans, about 3 million tons a year. Philadelphia, about 3 million also. And then Baltimore, Galveston, San Francisco running up the list. Two other important East Coast ports that were primarily export-oriented, though, were Norfolk, Virginia, and Savannah, Georgia. Norfolk being a major embarkation port for a shipment of coal to Europe. You had a number of problems facing Class I railways before the First World War. A Class I railway in 1916 was defined to be a railway with at least $1 million in operating revenues. By contrast, with 1916, you had about 54 Class I railways. By contrast, you have only 6 Class I railways right now in the U.S., and the cutoff is about $1 billion in revenue. Other railways are classified as Class II. We now call them regionals, and Class III, we now call them short lines. The American economy entered a severe recession in 1914, and the consequence was that a number of rail lines went into bankruptcy, including the Rock Island, Frisco, and Wabash, the Middle West, which also served the Kansas City market. That impacted about 1/6 of the network and highlighted the fact that you had a fair amount of excess capacity in the rail industry in the United States at the advent of the First World War. You also had a number of legal issues that were dogging the rail industry prior to 1917. In the post-Civil War era, American railways began operating so-called regional pools, where they would collaborate on things like sharing equipment and so forth to better coordinate intercompany traffic, but also led to cartelization of the rail industry and, in turn, antitrust issues. Under Roosevelt and Taft, those presidents used the Sherman and Clayton Acts to dissolve those pools. And in turn, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which has been around since 1887, could approve rail rates. But they had an act in 1906, but the burden of proof on rail companies to show the need for rate increases. As the shipper contested a rate increase, it was up to the railway to show that the rate increase was justifiable. There are also pre-war labor issues. In 1916, the major rail unions, also what were called back then brotherhoods of engineers, firemen, conductors, and trainmen, respectively, called for the 8-hour workday rather than the 10-hour workday. Negotiations collapsed on that point, and a strike occurred. Wilson had Congress pass the Adamson Act, forced the 8-hour limit on the rail industry, and that was eventually upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. Prior to the advent of the U.S. Railroad Administration, which ran railways during the First World War, in August 1916, Congress passed the so-called Army Appropriations Act that gave the federal government, quote, authority to take over U.S. railways during wartime. It also established a National Defense Council to coordinate industries in wartime other than railways. And after the declaration of war in April 1917, the American Railway Association, now called the Association of American Railroads, issued a pledge that the railroads of the United States would coordinate their operations in the continental rail system to produce a maximum national transportation efficiency. It also created a Railroads War Board to help guide the effort, the board consisting of the chief executive officers of the largest railways in the U.S. At the same time, Congress enacted the so-called ESH Act that gave the Interstate Commerce Commission authority to set rules on things like exchange of rail cars between rail companies. And also, Congress passed the Priority Act that gave the U.S. president authority to give preferences to certain types of freight, say coal movements or trip movements during the war. Railways wanted to return to pooling to expedite shipments of things like lumber, chemicals, and steel products. The then U.S. Attorney General said that he would prosecute railways so long as those were considered in violation of antitrust acts. In addition, despite pledges of cooperation after 1917, rail companies started to hoard rail cars, as they wouldn't share cars very much. The war board was reluctant to overrule individual railway companies' traffic policies, and that led to a lot of freight congestion, particularly in the Northeast, especially in Pennsylvania, showing up as a lack of, and among other things, they showed up as lack of coordination between shippers and ocean carriers. That is, you didn't have ships, you had loaded rail cars lining up in New Jersey and New York, but no ships to unload them to convert, or you had a lot of ships in port, but no rail cars to ship the freight from. And so in May of 1917, the first month after the war was declared in the U.S., that had soared to about 150,000 rail cars. That dropped slightly to 117 at the year's end. But in the fall of 1917, about 44,000 loaded freight cars parked at East Coast ports, primarily in the New York area, waiting to be unloaded. Next slide, please. And at one point, you had 180,000 freight cars parked within 200 miles of the New York ports. At the same time, railroads could not meet demands for movement of coal and grain. The Army gave incentives for production that paid firms when products were loaded on freight cars rather than when the products reached final domestic destination. That worsened the problem. Labor shortages began to rise in the rail industry as workers began to find better jobs elsewhere in the economy. Coal became scarcer. Back then, almost all engines were coal-fired. And the Interstate Commerce Commission also refused most requests for rate increases, and so railway companies found themselves squeezed between rising costs but more or less flat revenue. That led President Wilson to establish the United States Railroad Administration by proclamation, took effect at Christmas of 1917, and took control of all Class I railways and later several Class II ones. The Rail Administration had two major divisions in terms of, for our purposes, one was a division of operation that controlled and coordinated the operating activities of all railroads and water carriers, and division of traffic that handled matters involving traffic relations between carriers and the shipping public, including things like rates and other commercially related questions. This was the first general order that the USRA issued that basically said, continue what you're doing until we tell you otherwise. And this was just an organization chart of the USRA, in some ways very similar to other organizational charts you'd find in the US government. So in the start of 1918, the USRA controlled about 2.5 million freight cars, about 56,000 passenger cars, about 66,000 locomotives. And the Federal Control Act that was passed in March of 18 also gave USRA potential control over other railways, particularly Class II and Class III operations. Some of the major Class I railways were serving Kansas City at that time, with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, the Kansas City Southern, the Katy, the Rock Island, the Frisco, the Chicago Northwestern Railway, and also the Missouri Pacific. The administration of the USRA was led by the U.S. Treasury Secretary William McAdoo as the USRA Director General, but in practice, the Assistant Director, Walker Hines, ran the show. Hines was a former railway attorney. And what involved essentially was negotiating what amounted to leases with each railway. And those negotiations weren't completed until almost the end of the war in 1918. Because you had a legalized monopoly, pooling became legal. Railways are compensated based on average costs and profits in the 1914-1917 timeframe. But because of rising costs that started to go up after 1916, railways actually lost about $110 million in compensation due to the lower cost estimates. The USRA also was very intent on trying to standardize equipment. Individual railway companies had very different locomotive designs, steam locomotive designs that was based largely on things like terrain, the type of freight hauled. The USA moved to standardize those, first of all, by limiting production to only 3 manufacturers, Alco and Baldwin and Lima. Lima's in Ohio. Alco and Baldwin were outside of Philadelphia. And during this time frame, about 1,900 locomotives were ordered through the USRA. It also ordered about 100,000 standardized freight cars, mandated 12 locomotive designs, and particularly by limiting locomotive designs, you could make them easily serviceable throughout the country, particularly after locomotives were reassigned from the northeast to the northeast for the regions of the United States. This is a picture of a USRA locomotive. USRA locomotives either had USA on the tender or US on the tender to indicate ownership as such. So in 1915, rails were handling about 277 billion ton miles of freight. 1916, it rose by about 11%. 1970 rose by another 29%. 1918 by another 28%. But by 1919, after the war had ended, rail traffic dropped back to about the levels of 1915. There were some productivity issues facing the railways. The USRA encouraged shippers to load rail cars more efficiently, as that is, use whatever space they have. That increased car capacity effectively by up to 10%. They increased demurrage fees, which were penalties paid to shippers if they either didn't load cars fast enough or didn't unload them fast enough. The USRA strove to have rail freight move by the shortest route. This in particular helped make use of underutilized rail lines and reduce congestion on the historically crowded lines. And also rail yard managers tried to ensure that shipments would not leave until they had prompt delivery possible at the destination of such. In terms of labor relations, the Wilson administration was generally pro-union. The USRA worked pretty much hand in glove with the four rail brotherhoods, and particularly over things like wages and working conditions. Rail workers were leaving for better paying employment in their industries during the war, and eventually USRA mandated wage increases, sometimes up to 40% for the lowest paid job classifications. And otherwise, you had pro-labor rules instituted throughout the industry and to keep workers in place and make rail attractive to employees. In particular, the USRA mandated that men and women be paid the same wage in each occupational category. It created a women's service section headed by Pauline Goldmark, who became one of the highest-ranking women officials inside the Wilson administration during Wilson's administration. However, women could only work in occupations that were deemed to be helpful and fitted to their needs. The WSS, the Women's Service Section, determined which positions were not helpful or were otherwise unfitted. And as a rule, women were generally excluded from night shifts in the rail industry. They were involved, among other things, in rail maintenance, locomotive maintenance, as the picture illustrates. Within the USRA, you had a division of traffic that followed initially Interstate Commerce Commission, geographic destinations, the Eastern, Southern, and Western traffic committees. In addition, the USRA established eight regions on top of such to better coordinate rail activity. The Allegheny region, for instance, included Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and northern West Virginia, primarily to expedite shipments of coal and steel. Pocahontas region, southern West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, expedite shipment of coal. The southwestern region included southern Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, and the Kansas City market was included in the central west region. In terms of problems faced by the USRA, one problem is that you had largely one-way west to east coast traffic. That was an issue in the Second World War. We had two fronts going on. And the problem began actually in 1914 as U.S. supplied both Allied and Central powers with large amounts of one-way freight moving towards East Coast ports. And as German U-boat attacks increased in the Atlantic, that led some shipping companies to delay or stop ship movements across the Atlantic, creating further bottlenecks. The USRA purchased 155 million tons of coal during this administration. And although coal prices were controlled by the Federal Fuel Administration until early 1919, they did allow some significant price increases during this period, which created problems for railways in terms of the cost issues. And in particular, coal costs doubled for railways between 1916 and 1918. Rate increases were allowed, but the cost increases exceeded the revenue increases. And looking at the ratio of total operating costs to total revenue, the rail industry is called the operating ratio, that increased from 66% in 1916 to 82% in 1918 to 94% in 1920. The latter was reflecting the 1920 number reflects, in particular, drop-off of rail traffic after the war ended. Operating costs do not include things like loan payments, property taxes, and so forth. And so during this period of USRA control, the rail industry actually lost about $1 billion during that time frame. In contrast to freight haulage, domestic rail movement of troops went fairly smoothly. Most Army training bases were in the southeast, so you had troop movements from recruits and draftees to the southeast, movements of soldiers from the southeast, mostly to the New York port. Recruits and draftees usually travel by regular scheduled passenger trains to their basic training sites. The average trip was about 400 miles for such. And for movements from embarkation points, had troop movements coordinated through a routing center established by the RA, Railway Association. By the war's end, the rails had carried about 4.5 billion passenger miles of military personnel. Typical troop train in this era consisted of 12 passenger cars plus baggage and or freight cars, usually carrying about 450 soldiers. Troop trains were usually scheduled 30 days in advance to assure needed rail cars and locomotives. You had field kitchens set up in converted passenger cars, but oftentimes those weren't very workable, and oftentimes soldiers ended up eating cold rations during their trips. Troop trains from the southeast to New York used the Baltimore and Ohio trackage from the District of Columbia to New Jersey, in particular to a place called Camp Merrill. But this created congestion issues, particularly around the District of Columbia. Freight trains, on the other hand, used parallel Pennsylvania Railway trackage and didn't encounter those types of issues necessarily. In terms of passenger traffic, the USRA reduced the number of scheduled passenger trains in order to conserve on coal and free up passenger cars for troop movements. And the USRA estimated that it reduced passenger mileage by about 12 million passenger miles. Railways were also encouraged to consolidate traffic ticket offices and passenger depots together to create jointly run passenger stations, so-called union stations. They already existed in several large pre-war cities, particularly St. Louis and Kansas City, but expanded during the war years into other cities like Indianapolis. And the total number of passengers grew from about 1 billion in 1916 to about 1.1 billion in 1918. The average number of passengers per train rose from 55 to 76, implying a significant fewer number of passenger trains being operated during the war years. In terms of what happened after the end of the war, you had a rather vigorous debate over what would happen to American railroads. The Plum Act, which was endorsed by the rail unions, called for permanent nationalization of railways. There wasn't much public support for such. The USRA itself proposed a 5-year transition plan during which it would try to revitalize the rail industry financially. Wilson himself had supported moving Michigan federal control early on with a date of March 1st, 1920 being the target for such privatization. And Congress eventually passed the Transportation Act, the so-called Ash-Cummins Act in 1920, close to that deadline. The Transportation Act transferred control of railways back to private companies. It increased the authority of the Interstate Commerce Commission over rates and mergers. Between March and September of 1920, the U.S. government paid rail companies about $500 million as a means to return to profitability. And supposedly rail rates were set to guarantee a 5.5% return on rail investment. Guarantee in quotes, and that was a target, but it wasn't a legally fast number. But a consequence of that is the rail rates went up by as much as 40%, depending on the region of the country and the type of product carried involved. Under Ash-Cummins, the U.S. was authorized to continue for another 2 years to process financial claims for rail companies. The act also authorized ICC to develop a consolidation plan to merge profitable with unprofitable companies, increase the number of Class 1 railways from 53 to about 25, but profitable rail companies had nothing to do with that, and so eventually the plan died. Ash-Cummins did establish a railway labor board that ordered wages increased by 22% at war's end. In the following decade, in the 1920s, railways are generally profitable. They invested heavily in new equipment, particularly new signaling systems, and improved trackage. But the Great Depression created numerous bankruptcies. The rail industry didn't fully recover until the World War II traffic surge. After 1945, increased competition aided into the rail freight market, as did auto travel into the passenger market. Post-1945, we had several merger waves occurring that eventually led to the currently high oligopolistic market structure. And in 1980, Congress passed the Staggers Act, which essentially ended federal economic regulation of railroads, particularly things over like track abandonment and rail rates. Well, that's it. Any questions?
Why did the traffic go up so much before we actually got into the war?
A lot of it was supplying the British in particular. That traffic was fairly heavy. But it wasn't really until 1970 you saw a more significant jump in rail traffic.
Bruce Hubbard, what happened in England in the same time? Did the railroads expand greatly?
Yes, quite considerably. As with the United States, there were a multiplicity of railway companies, and they were nationalised. And then in the early 1920s, returned to private control, but to 6 major companies, which tended not to be in competition because they were each sort of split into regions. So that, for instance, the London Midland Scottish went from London up to Scotland along the east coast, whereas another one of the companies that formed went along the west coast to get up to Glasgow. So there was nationalisation during the war under the Defence of the Realm Act, but straight after the war, like in the United States, they were handed back, but not to the original companies, but to sort of forced amalgamations of companies. I was interested in what was said there about the United States, in effect, nationalising during the war. That almost smacks of socialism, which I think is almost a dirty word at the time in the United States. Was there a opposition in the United States to the government running railways?
I think it was an issue of practicality. That is, Wilson favored temporary nationalization, but not permanent nationalization. And I think he saw it as an issue that initially, before Wilson enacted the U.S. Railway Administration, he tried to leave things to the private sector, but it wasn't working very well because there was still some hesitancy among the rail companies to really cooperate that closely. As we talked about earlier, the reluctance to share equipment and whatnot, and to hoard traffic, if you will. And that led to the decision to set up the USRA.
I think the presentation on the railroad, Mark, thank you for doing that. Yeah, I certainly didn't know that the railroads had been effectively nationalized, or at least put under a very controlling bureaucracy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating that afterwards they went back to pretty much the same sort of system that they had before. There was a big push to nationalize after World War II when they kind of did the same thing. The feds pretty much took over the railroads, or at least took over running them.
Yeah. Well, you had in World War II, you didn't have the East-West issue because you had shipments going both directions, and so there wasn't the freight imbalance you had during the First World War. I think also the railways by that time realized that if they didn't cooperate as well as they didn't cooperate well among themselves in getting things shipped, they would probably face nationalization.
It's nothing like an existential threat to get people cooperating with one another.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you all for attending and giving your thoughts. And Mark, thank you very much for the presentation.